I would like to, first of all, thank you all for sticking it out. It's been a long and I think really engaging and informative day. My job as moderator in the last panel of the day, is to keep you all awake and here for the reception. And what I'd like to do briefly first is simply introduce the distinguished panel I have up here with me, and then I'm going to turn it over to them to speak for 15 minutes apiece, and then we'll have questions and answers, and then we'll have drinks and refreshments. Give me a moment to get my papers together here. So our first speaker today is John on this panel is John Kirlin, who is the executive director of Delta Vision, which is, as I understand it, created by an executive order of the governor to manage a planning process concerning resource use in the Sacramento Delta. Dr. Kirlin has over 3 decades of experience analyzing policies, administration, and financing directed at complex public problems, particularly in California. He's the founding editor of California Policy Choices, the author of several studies on Proposition 13, and he's a former professor of public affairs at the University of Southern California and at Indiana University. Gene Ross is here with us, the executive director of the California Budget Project, an independent Sacramento-based think tank that engages in independent fiscal and policy analysis and public education to educate people about the California budget process with the goal of improving public policies affecting the economic and social well-being of all Californians, and low and middle-income Californians in particular. John Sonstelie, professor of economics at UC Santa Barbara, and a fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. I think it's fair to describe him as the foremost expert on school finance in California. He's written literally dozens of papers and policy reports on property taxation, school finance, and public budgeting in the state. And Kirk Stark, a professor of law from UC Los Angeles, who's written extensively on fiscal federalism, has served as faculty coordinator of the UCLA Colloquium on tax policy and public finance, and is a member of the board of directors of the National Tax Association, a professional organization that provides a major outlet for scholarship on the impacts of Proposition 13 and on public finance and budgeting in general. So without further ado, please welcome John Kirlin.
Well, thank you. And if I could get the few slides I have up, I'd appreciate it.
There. Boy. How do I get out of this? There we go.
As this gets started, I should say that it's sort of amazing. It's been 30 years since Proposition 13 passed. I was struck by how young Jerry Brown looked. You may get a chance to vote for him for governor, you know. And none of the rest of us have aged at all since then, so, but it's good to see a whole new generation wrestling with these issues. I want to talk about the fiscal issue, and one of the ways I've thought about this is fiscal constraint and adaptation in the face of some wicked problems. Wicked problems are a concept from people who think about decision-making. Sometimes people have like even 8 or 10 or 12 characteristics of a wicked problem, but from my perspective, there are really 2 that are important. One, there are real severe value conflicts involved. And second, there's equally severe uncertainty and conflict in 2 areas, about the causes of the problem and about what to do. And that's fiscal policy in California. And I want to talk a little bit about the pre-Proposition 13 context and then post-Proposition 13, just to set this and then go forward. Pre-Proposition 13, we heard a little bit of discussion about this in the last meeting, but conceptually, from my perspective, there was a big debate about tax relief versus redistribution. And in a moment, I'm going to read just what was in AB 999 as major features, which was Willie Brown's bill to deal with tax relief just before Proposition 13 passed as an example of emphasis on redistribution. And tax relief was neatly encapsulated in Prop 13. Another issue was who got the fiscal gains from the growth of the California tax base and the revenue system. And that we didn't talk about very much. So let me just quickly mention one feature of that, which was that the California economy, of course, it grows pretty constantly, and it was growing in the years before Proposition 13 was passed, and it was talked about generally. But in the news clip, there was a mention of the large surplus that was sitting at the state government. And part of that was because the income tax in California is very elastic, and the state revenue system was very elastic. The other thing was that under school equalization funding, the state then and still puts the last dollar into school finance. And so as property tax reassessment kicked in at the local level, actually the state share of school financing was declining immediately prior to Proposition 13. So it wasn't only, as was observed, that taxpayers, sort of unhinged their tax bill, what was happening to local taxes, but actually the total, the state was reducing its share too. So the state was really a gainer in the pre-Proposition 13 tax system, the fiscal system, the way it operated. So, and there was conflict about that, and then there were uncertainty about property tax levels, what was really happening, and especially relationship to personal income, and who was paying the property tax, and that fed into the redistribution. I'll turn to that in a moment. Post-Proposition 13, there's still value conflicts about fiscal cuts versus adaptation. The sort of value choices about the size of the public sector encapsulate part of that, but the other way that part of this literature turned about, should we just take the cuts or should we find ways to generate new revenues? And in general, California has found ways to generate new revenues. And so if you look at the revenues that are available to California in aggregate or in almost any category, and you adjust them for inflation and per capita growth, there's more today than there was before. That's not an argument about adequacy, that's just empirically what we've gotten. The other issue that is value conflict is about state dominance and who gets to make the decisions versus sort of local fiscal capacity is one way I talk about it. Some of the uncertainty in the conflict about causes is encapsulated here. How you're going to accommodate demographic change has been huge in California, economic growth. And you also have changing policy preferences. We want different things we wanted out of government in the 1960s. One of the things we don't talk about very much is what's happening around us in the natural system. And I'm going to end with a discussion, but the punchline is essentially this system of making policies and of financing activities doesn't deal very well with some collapses we're having in our ecosystems and with the threats we see with climate change. And so as we look forward, we're going to need a radically different way of thinking about our policy choices and financing that has been talked about historically and that has been encapsulated in this conversation about Prop 13. That game is going to go away, I think, or we're going to have to add a new game to it. A lot of this is already been talked about, so I'm actually not going to spend any time here. I want to talk a little bit about adaptations, and I last stopped working seriously on Prop 13 about 10 years ago when I moved to Indiana. Before that, I was chronicling pretty regularly the sort of adaptations that were taking place. A lot of them were local. These are some of the big ones. The local sales tax to fund transportation. Every metropolitan county in California has a sales tax which pays for transportation. At one point, that was as much as a third of the tax money that was going into the transportation system in California. A very big difference from before Proposition 13, and that sort of relieved the state of the need to make those financial expenditures. There was also a substantial shift of financing infrastructure and other costs to developers. The state institutionalized, no longer pays for freeway off-ramps, as an example. Those are local land use and developer obligations. All sorts of infrastructure, all the way down to fire stations, schools, and even fire trucks is paid as a normal course of development now. The state came along and put in instruments like Mello-Roos financing to facilitate that, but it started even before the state had those instruments. We already heard about fiscalization of land use. There's also substantially increased use of debt in California. I haven't gone back and checked the number, but at one time when Jess Unruh was treasurer and I was asked as a consultant to look at debt in California, we had either the lowest or amongst the various lowest of any industrialized state, and in any measure of fiscal capacity, had a huge debt capacity. We've now bumped up, filled that hole, if you will, and we're using debt aggressively. Let me talk a little bit about, the fiscal adaptation we already did. What are some of the fiscal consequences? And again, all of these have really been talked about, so I'm not going to talk about them, except this whole notion of cycles of constraint and adaptation and then finding new ways to adapt are worth, you can sort of lay them out chronologically. I want to talk a little bit about policy consequences. Here I've used the word paralysis. Certainly, I find I oftentimes use the word constraints. We heard about the fiscalization of land use. We also have the fiscalization of policy processes. It's hard now to get a new policy launched without the ability to generate a new revenue source for it, because you essentially lock things in. So in a moment when I talk about some of the challenges we face in the resources area, we're having to generate new streams of finances for that. And increasingly, those are bond finances, so we're using debt instruments rather than taxes. They're increasingly bonds and fees. I don't think that's stable and supportable for the long run. We have what I call our sort of hardened silos of policymaking, financing, analysis, and dialogue. I work across all sorts of policy areas. I was an expert for the state on an education case. I was an expert against the state. And I actually noticed it was mentioned in the San Diego challenges in Dave Doerr's on AB 8 allocations. I work now in a bunch of resources issues. I worked on regional governance. And in every area I go to, I find there's a group of people working in that area, know that area really well, and they don't talk across that area. And that's in the policy community process and in the academic process. And it's the interest groups all organized that way. It's become increasingly siloed, so it's really hard to have a dialogue or to make decisions about that are broad and forward-looking for California. Our processes are also less intelligible, transparent, malleable. It's just hard to change them. All that advantages the insiders. So if you're in the game, you have an allocation, you fight hard to protect that. So if you're in education, Prop 98 is a holy grail. If you're in mental health services, the initiative that is providing you some new funding, that's the holy grail. Whatever it is, that's what you work around and finance and argue for, and that's your cut into the fiscal system. So it's really affecting the way in which you make policy. And that's what I wanted to talk about sort of as ending, the challenges that poses for resources policies. In the discussion that people have about what the public sector should be, I've been struck in this conversation and many conversations about Proposition 13 for many years. It's taken two sorts of general discussions. One, the size of the public sector, and then an equity discussion, which is focused on service delivery. And actually, I forgot to read this very quick thing from Prop AB 999 because it sort of encapsulates some of the discussion of the equity issues that were involved in the discussion leading up and the way the legislature tied itself in knots and couldn't respond before Proposition 13, but it continues. AB 999, which came out of Willie Brown as the author, included a circuit breaker for homeowners, renter relief, senior citizens property tax deferral, procedures for reimbursing local governments and state mandated costs, assessment reform, a split property assessment role, and then it also included deletion of several tax expenditure features of existing sales and income taxes and higher personal income taxes. It was an incredibly complicated piece of legislation. And so when people talk about moving forward and wrestling with those challenges, I think it's really hard to get there. And since I'm going to make the argument that in some sense we need to change from a discussion of service delivery and equity and to focus on some resource problems, we need to find a way to either settle that set of discussions or at least get past them and engage some other discussions. I'm just going to throw up 3 slides that illustrate some of the resources problems. I'm currently working on Delta Vision. When I left California and went to Indiana, still as a university professor, I worked on a bunch of different problems in Indiana. I came back and got engaged in working on something called the Marine Life Protection Act, passed by the state of California in 1999. The state tried 3 times to implement it and failed each time, in large part because of lack of resources in the state. There's a concept of hollowing out the state. It's really clear in the resources area. This is an effort to move to ecosystem management, to concepts like land use planning in the ocean, to create reserve areas. We had some funding, some $7 million from some foundations, set up a process, an advisory process with a task force for 2 years, and ended up creating these projected areas. And then those were approved by the California Department of Fish and Game. They have now proposed a new set that I stepped out of the role of executive director. Someone else took over. They just finished the process. This for Pigeon Point to Point Arena. Next, they're going to go to Southern California. This is taking millions of dollars to do the planning process, and it'll take tens of millions of dollars to implement. And so the state has to find ways to get them there. It's a huge resource issue. Our fisheries are in a collapse. In the absence of activities like this, we will essentially have mined them down totally. The next thing I'm going to show you is I'm currently working on Delta Vision. The California Delta, which starts out here, sort of, you can think of conceptually at Carquinez Straits, goes to Sacramento in the north, Stockton and Tracy in the south, is the largest estuary in the west coast to North and South America. It provides water for some 2/3 of California, get some of their drinking water from the Delta. It is a huge and valued ecosystem, and we have so altered it that it can collapse again. So we're trying to deal with that. The other problem was millions of dollars, tens of millions. This will be tens of billions to address. It will involve the task force I'm working for, which did a vision, which came out in '07, and now do a strategic plan. We'll end up with a set of expenditures that will be in tens of billions, and it'll be at that rate for several decades until you can get these problems in hand. If you don't deal with this, you don't have water. Think about that. So you really have to deal with these resources. Issues are going to come up. They're going to be brought into the political system. They have some equity dimensions, but very different than the way people have talked about equity in this conversation today or typically talk about equity. And the financing instruments are currently all this is financed off of user fees, or most of it off of fees and bond debt, and it's going to require some large general fund obligations to survive. Some of you may have seen this. Have you seen anything BCDC is doing on sea level rise? We're doing a lot on sea level rise incidentally in Delta Vision. Our scientists say we should use a planning threshold of 55 inches by 2100. We've had 7 inches of sea level rise at the Golden Gate since the turn of the century. This is what 1 meter sea level rise does to San Francisco Airport, puts it underwater. Does the same thing to Oakland Airport. It does the same thing to the South Bay. Big differences. So we're going to again spend a lot of money as a society dealing with natural systems that we thought sort of took for granted. And my point about talking about them today is the fiscal system was devised before Proposition 13 did some of this. We put in place big infrastructure systems, a water system, an education system, a road system. We sort of coasted on that investment with minor, modest adjustments and investments. Now we're going to face a new round of large investments in infrastructure systems, and the fiscal system we have is not very well prepared to do that. Thank you.
Something bad going to happen. Something bad is going to happen. Okay.
We'll just put the other.
I just need a place to put some notes. Thank you. This is certainly, it's always a challenge to be at the end of a long and information-packed day. This is actually the second version of my remarks for today, because when I woke up on Wednesday morning and read Peter Schragg's column in the Sacramento Bee, I realized that it was almost identical to the talking points that I had already prepared for today. And so I could have just kept the same notes and said, I second everything Peter said, and we could be to the reception that much earlier, but I decided not to do that. So here is, and Peter anticipated the second version of my remarks with his question at the end of the last panel, and I think we find ourselves on the same page in a lot of these issues quite frequently. This version of my remarks was really prompted and sort of crystallized by an NPR story that I heard this morning, which looked back at the other significant event that happened in California in a year ending in an 8. That's been in the national news, certainly the past week, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, which occurred a decade earlier. And I think when you hear the commentary about the changes in our country, the changes in this state that have occurred, that Proposition 13 really did represent an inflection point in California's history. And I think I probably would agree with Mary Bergen in her question to the last panel that voters perhaps weren't quite as well as informed as the speaker on the previous panel might imply. But I think certainly his research findings do get to much broader changes that were underlying events in California, and particularly the debates around the role of government and the role of public services in California that I think are really much more important. The other important thing that happened in June of 1978 is that I graduated from the University of California, and I periodically give thanks for the fact that I am the last of a generation to have been educated during the free spending era, or the free spending post-war era of California. And I mean that with all seriousness, because certainly the investment that my parents' generation made in public education, in this institution, in the K-12 system in California, gave rise to tremendous opportunity. And I think that we have really broken with that past. And that is the true significance, more than whether or not we're locked in to our homes for an extra year, about what Prop 13 has meant for California. And we have heard a lot and talked a lot about the property tax. I'm going to talk about a different feature of Proposition 13 that wasn't mentioned in the news clips that we saw after lunch, but I actually think has been the most important part of Proposition 13 and its legacy to California. And that's the supermajority vote requirement for passing a state tax increase. And I would argue that it is inherently undemocratic, and it really represented old California and older Californians breaking trust with new California and new Californians. And my board member, Dean Tipps, who's here in the audience, who was one of the foremost lobbyists and opponents of Prop 13, reminded me that it was the state's supermajority vote requirements that actually prevented a meaningful alternative from Proposition 13 ending up on the ballot in 1978, not because of the need for a 2/3 vote, because it would have been an urgency bill. I'm seeing some legislative wonks saying it wasn't a tax increase. What would it have been? The need for an urgency clause. And that prevented a compromise that could have led to a very different California. Why do I think this really is at the heart of Prop 13? If we hadn't had, if Prop 13 hadn't contained the 2/3 vote requirement, the legislature could have spent the surplus. After they spent down the surplus, increased taxes at the state level, achieved school equalization, numbers of other things. And we would have had a different tax system today, but probably public services that looked a lot like they did prior to Prop 13, albeit with more control at the state level. And again, I think this gets to a question in one of the panels. I think this isn't what has happened as a result of the 2/3 vote, isn't an unintended consequence. And there certainly are a lot of unintended consequences from Prop 13. And there was a wonderful quote from Paul Gann, who Joel chose not to channel in his remarks today, in the San Francisco Chronicle. Quote, "We want to reduce the size of government. Our ballot measures don't say it in so many words, but that's understood to be on the top of any initiative we put on the ballot." That was the goal of Prop 13 from the beginning. And again, if it had been only about protecting old people from being taxed out of our homes, a number of other ways to achieve those goals. Why has Prop 13 been so important and so significant for California? It was passed at a time when California was at the beginning of another growth spurt. Our population has increased by more than half since then. We're adding the equivalent of the city of Oakland and the city of Richmond to California every year. We have no resources to pay for it. We're becoming increasingly more diverse, and that implies a number of costs for our public services. We don't have the ability to meet those demands through our existing tax system. Finally, the fastest growing parts of our population are the elderly people who soon may live to regret Prop 13 when there's nobody to pay their nursing home bills, but I guess that could be seen as just desserts for what happened decades prior. And the younger California, because most nursing home care in California is paid for by public dollars, and the youngest Californians who are facing a public education system that other speakers have spoken to. The legacy, again, ballot box budgeting. Why would I say we have so many different types and such frequency of ballot box budgeting in California? Two things. They're the direct progeny, Proposition 98, which attempted to bolster school funding in light of the tax limitations. Measures like Proposition 1A of 2004, which is probably the least transparent measure ever enacted by any electorate or legislative body, anyhow, that locks into place the most convoluted system of financing government that you can possibly imagine. The second variety of ballot box budgeting proposals are the free lunch varieties. And I think taxpayers have learned to understand you can vote for bonds, you can vote for preschool, you can vote for another measure. Because of the 2/3 vote limitation, it doesn't translate into higher taxes. What does it translate into then? A public school system, but by recent findings of the Governor's Commission on Education Excellence, spends over $10 billion less per year than would be required to adequately fund education for all of California's school children. A healthcare system that's on the brink of collapse. And I would recommend the article in the New York Times this week about the trauma care, the recurring problems of the trauma care system in Los Angeles. We have a healthcare system and a governor who doesn't believe in directly increasing taxes, but has put forward budget proposals that would result in 500,000 Californians losing health coverage, reducing funding for our health care system, even though a year ago the same governor was telling us that the uninsured and underfunding of our public health care systems constituted a hidden tax on all of the insured and Californians. I have certain problems with that, but again, by that same logic structure. We're limiting access to higher education, and we're sitting here in the University of California, and I think that is important to talk about. We are on the edge of a dramatic transformation in the California economy and with the workforce of California. I'm at the not quite the tail end, almost the tail end of the baby boomers, and my crowd and everyone older than us hopes to retire sometime soon, which will leave a tremendous hole in the workforce of the future for California. In California, and I think Joel mentioned some of the traditional business climate statistics about California. We have never, will never, can never, do not want to ever compete as a low-cost place to do business. I don't think any of us in this room want that for California's future. And unless we pursue that path in an increasingly globalized economy, the only way we can succeed is to have the best workforce in the world, bar none, because we will always be one of the most expensive places to do business in the world, bar none. I hope that nobody would disagree when I say that we are significantly falling short in this regard. And perhaps one of my colleagues from the university can tell me what percentage of the math and science and information technology graduate students at this institution will go home to the country that they came from because they don't feel that they have the opportunities in this country in the future. So now we're looking at a budget, and I'm always loath to cry wolf. There are two things that people like me are often accused of doing, and one is blaming all of California's ills on Proposition 13. Maybe not all of them, but I think a good 95% of them probably do come back to Proposition 13. Growing income inequality, an issue that my organization has written a lot about, certainly is attributable to broader economic trends, but to the extent that the best path for narrowing that inequality is education. I think, again, even there, we can make a good link back to Proposition 13. The other thing that people like me are frequently accused by people like Joel of doing is crying wolf and saying that our public systems are going to fall apart. And I think we certainly saw that again in the clips after lunch. And I have learned, I've been in this business long enough, that I don't say that our systems are going to suffer traumatic failure and put a time or date, at least I don't put a time or date certain on that. But I do think that we cannot as Californians continue to stretch things thin indefinitely. I won't say that if we do not do something very differently next year, that we will see the bridges fall into the ocean or other cataclysmic failure. But I do think we are potentially reaching the breaking point. I think the coping mechanisms that our fiscal systems have used to muddle through are getting stranger and stranger, is probably the most polite thing I can say, because we have nothing else that we can do in California. So we've come full cycle. The best thing that I can say is that we've made it this far. The worst thing I can say is that we are where we are today, and I'd invite you to come up to Sacramento if you want to elaborate on that topic. And I do think that the real challenge facing us as we look forward for California is whether or not we will be willing to take stock of the decisions that have been made, and whether we will be willing to have the kind of shared faith in the future that my parents had for California to give the next generation a real chance to make a difference. Thank you.
Oh, okay. And where's that pointer? Oh, there it is. Good afternoon. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Isaac, for inviting me and Jack. It's particularly good for me to be here because this is the last day of the term at UC Santa Barbara. And at 10 o'clock today, instead of me standing in front of 410 students in Econ 1 doing one more lecture about comparative advantage in international trade, it was one of my colleagues. And, you know, if he was successful, we have moved the percentage to understand that concept from about 15 to 16%. Actually, I would think Bill and I were remarking during this conversation, during the conversation earlier, that the same comment could be made about tax incidence as discussed by those of us here. It seems to be one of the more slippery concepts. Who bears the burden of the tax? All right. So because I'm feeling so good, I've decided to set a challenge for myself. And the challenge is to defend Bill Fiscal, Joel Fox, and John Fund, all in one 15-minute period. And whether I am able to do this or not, we'll see. It is a steep challenge. Let me just say, first of all, that regardless of what you think about Bill's argument, Proposition 13 was a dividing line for California public schools. Before 13, the revenue that school districts had was decided by their taxpayers in local tax rate referendum. After 13, the revenue that school districts have was decided by their state legislators. Okay? And the mechanism for doing that we've already discussed. Basically, Proposition 13 transferred authority over the property tax from you and I to our elected representatives in Sacramento. Now, what I want to do, so in other words, I guess, is what we have here is what social scientists would call a natural experiment. It's not perfect, but it's a natural experiment in fiscal federalism. We have moved an important area of government services, I think I would argue the most important one, which is our K-12 public schools, from local finance to state finance, all in one day. So what I want to focus on today is what are some of the consequences of that. And there I slipped into some bad language. I want to be careful about using the word causation and consequences. There's a break, before and after, and I want to look at after and compare it to a certain extent to before. I have some views about the lengths of causation, but I think I should save those for a question and answer period, and let's just kind of concentrate on the facts. I think that's what we can do in 15 minutes. And then, of course, I do have to rescue the Three Musketeers at the end, so I have my work cut out for me. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is just talk a little bit about the level of resources in California schools. So in general, let me just preview this. I want to talk about mostly school finance. I want to talk about the level of resources, the distribution of resources. I want to talk a little bit about student achievement and a little bit about private school enrollment. And I think you'll see how those all fit together. So here we have current expenditures on elementary and secondary education. And the dark line is California, and the gray line is all other states besides California, okay? And these are current expenditures adjusted for inflation, so no capital expenditures. This is the stuff that operates schools on a daily basis. And if you look at this chart, you can see a very clear trend. Here we are in the 70s, we're about 15% above the other states. In the 80s, we're about even. In the 90s, we fall below, and we kind of end in this period about 5% below. So making that transition from the early 1970s to today, I would say we have fallen about 20% in current expenditures per pupil relative to the rest of the country. Okay, so we are not interested really in expenditures, and that's a big mistake that people often make in this game. What we're really interested in is resources. And in schools, resources are people. 80% of a school's budget or a school district's budget is the salary and benefit of teachers. So here we're going to do a little exercise where we're going to go from current expenditures per pupil to staff per pupil. So if we look at the top row here, here's California. We start with $8,000 per student in current expenditures. This is 2004-05. We divide that by, we separate out the non-compensation part of that. So we have the salaries and benefits of school employees. That gets us to 80% of this number, which is 6,500. Then we put in compensation per staff member. And we divide that number by this number, and that's this ratio of staff per student. So this number is 0.089, 89 staff members per 1,000 students. The next line, we do this for the US minus California, and you can see the difference. We start with a little bit more spending. That leads to a little bit more compensation or salaries and benefits per student, lower salaries for teachers and other school employees in the rest of the country, and a ratio of 129 staff per student. And we can do this in, teachers, administrators, support personnel, it's all the same. So the bottom line here is that right now in California schools, we have 70% of the staff per pupil of schools in the rest of the country. Okay? It's not administrators. We actually have fewer administrators, interestingly enough. Okay. So I would argue based on, and actually you heard this from Bill, who is earlier, I would argue that that has an effect on the perception of school quality. He saw it in the large class sizes in Forest Peabody, which is actually a half a block from my house, and the pride and joy of our neighborhood. But it has a perception on how people think about their schools. And so one reaction you want to look at is, do they still send their kids there? Okay, so here we have private school enrollment in 1970 and 2000 from the US Census, and I've broken it down by families of different income. So basically income deciles, okay? So we just divide the income distribution, family income, into these deciles. Now these are families with children, okay? And you can see that it's pretty much the same until you...
First is lowest income, right?
Yes, this is the lowest income, and this is the highest. Thank you, Bill. Now that I'm trying to defend you, you're trying to help me, right? Okay, that's good. That's unusual, but good. Okay, so you can see that private school enrollment has increased a little bit at the 9th and 10th decile, and that's kind of where we'd expect this change to happen. Those are the people who can actually afford to send their kids to private schools, the Berkeley professors that Bill noted. Not the Santa Barbara professors, though. Another indication of quality is just how do students perform on standardized tests? And it's not a great indication of quality. I have a lot of problems with it, and I know Peter Will has many problems with it. But it's a measure. It's a measure. And, if you look at California's test scores, this is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's a random sample of students throughout the country. You look at the performance of California schools, students, it's poor. But we have more students from immigrant families than any other state in the country, and they always score poorly on these tests. So what I did is I've taken out those students. I just have students who are classified as being fluent in English. And you can see the scores there. These are average scores for 4th and 8th graders. That's the two levels at which we test students in reading and math. And California is below the national average and below every other state, every other large state. Okay, so those don't look too good for this little natural experiment. We've got low resources, we've got high-income families bailing out of the public school system, and we've got poor student achievement. One thing, though, if you think about this transformation from local to state finance, one thing that state finance can do is it can target districts and jurisdictions that, in your view, may need more resources. So let me try to explain that. So the benefit of local finance, we always say, the thing that we're throwing away, is that the local taxpayers decide. And if they don't like the tax and service level they get, they can move someplace else. Okay? That's our traditional argument for local finance. But one of the problems with that argument is, yeah, they get to decide, what if I actually care about the services received by somebody in another jurisdiction? That can happen too, okay? Well, in education, that does happen big time. We do care about that. In fact, we have state standards, and we assess, we assess what students are learning in every school district, and we have set standards for what they should achieve, okay? And that's a national movement, and we all have looked very closely at these test scores. Well, our goal for California, in California we call this the Academic Performance Index. Our goal in California is to have every school have an 800 API, okay? Here are all the elementary schools in California. There are 5,000 of them, and here are their APIs displayed as plotted against the percentage of their kids who are in free or reduced price lunch. So think about that as about family income of about 40,000 or less. That's pretty close. And you can see there's a very strong negative correlation here, okay? Well, that would, if you think state finance is what you want to do, that tells you where you want to invest. You have a high standard that you've established, 800 in every school, and these are the schools that are failing. So do we invest in those schools? Have we taken advantage of that aspect of state finance? Well, we do have many programs now. We have about 100 revenue programs that get money from Sacramento down to your school district. And 10 to 12 of them are actually targeted on low-income kids, okay? And, and here is the dollar amount per pupil in those programs as a function of the number of kids who are poor. And I'm sorry here, I realize this is actually a different measure of poverty. It's a lower threshold, but here are the poorest school districts, and here are the richest ones. And you can see these are the unified school districts that are reasonably sized. The same picture for other school districts. You can see the trend. Yes, we do give more money for those schools in low-income areas, but it's not much more. If you think about it, it's about $500 a kid more at the top end versus the bottom end. Okay, so a quick summary and then my attempt at defense. So here are the most salient things that I think have happened to public education since Prop 98. Expenditures per pupil fell relative to the rest of the nation. Here's the most important one. Staff per pupil is about 70% of the ratio in other states. I don't even know why I put this one up. This is the relevant thing. Student achievement lags the rest of the country. Private school enrollment has increased a little bit, but particularly among high-income families. And then the state revenue is, as we would expect with a state finance system, is tilted slightly towards these districts that probably need more help, although I would argue not enough, at least given the result. Okay, so now, now my attempt at defense. Okay, so, this doesn't look too good for local finance, but you got to remember that we still have the institutions of local governance. We still elect school boards, and they're still in charge of basically how schools run. And that's a big problem with our accountability standards. We're constantly running against this, wishes of Sacramento versus the wishes of local school districts. So we have a fair test of local finance, I would maintain, only when we eliminate local governance. We'd have a fair test of state finance, that is, only when we eliminate local governance. So I think the Proposition 13 revolution will be over, or will be complete, I should say, when we don't have school districts any longer. We just have one Department of Education running all 8,000 schools in California. That is the essence of Proposition 13. To take away local finance means that we take away local governance also. So now, if that's the concept, and now I know I can see the people thinking I'm not serious. I actually am quite serious about this. There are many institutions that run very effectively and very well at that level. So not all, but it can certainly be done. Now, if we go that route, and here's my defense, do we really need the property tax? The only real reason for a property tax is we hate it and it doesn't work. The only real reason for it is the only good local tax, because you can't tax sales and income at the local level. Property doesn't move, okay? But if you don't need local finance, you don't need the property tax. So that's how I come together with Bill and Joel. So Bill thinks Serrano caused Proposition 13. I don't know. But let's put it this way. With Serrano, we really didn't need the local property tax, and we don't really need to defend it anymore. So let's just get rid of it. Let's just substitute a income tax that's, kind of across the board at about 6% and eliminate the property tax altogether. We could work that system. And as far as John goes, I don't think I can defend him because I can't remember the exact, I was trying to remember the thing about expenditures that he had, but, I know what it is. He is right that we've increased spending on schools in California. He's absolutely right about that. Not at the rate the rest of the country is, but, schools are people. And you increase spending on them because you have to pay people more to be teachers than you did in 1970. So, yeah. So we just, that's what we're doing. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to Isaac and to Jack and everyone else who's put this on. This has been a wonderful opportunity to learn a great deal about something that most of us thought we probably knew a lot about already. I certainly have learned a lot today. By my count, I think I am the 17th speaker, 17th and final speaker, so I will keep my remarks brief because I know you're itching to get to the refreshments, we'll call them. I wanted to begin my remarks with a quote from a book by economists Jeffrey Brennan and James Buchanan. The title of their book is The Power to Tax: Analytical Foundations of a Fiscal Constitution, which was published in 1980. And the quote reads, "The taxpayer revolution has indeed been born without an analytical blueprint or even an analytical map." And I think if there's one thing that the 30 years here in California has taught us is that there is a core truth to that statement. And one of the things that I've learned here today that's evident from the remarks that have been offered is that Proposition 13 wasn't just a single event on June 6th of 1978. It was really just the first step in an ongoing process. I'm not sure we've reached a sort of political equilibrium of for our fiscal constitution here in California. It's really an ongoing project of writing and rewriting and renegotiating the foundational rules of our fiscal constitution. And that's a process that involves initiatives, that involves the legislature, that involves local politicians, it certainly involves the courts, and I think everyone here knows that there's a long, complicated history of how things have changed even within Proposition 13 over the past 30 years. Now, in my remarks, I want to focus on what Proposition 13 has done for decentralized political decision-making in California. And here I'm building a little bit on John's remarks from a few moments ago. I think it's fair to say that the principal virtue of local government is to allow people to make decisions locally and to allow individuals to sort into communities that offer a package of taxes and services that most closely approximates their preferences, and then to exert their own influence on that package going forward. And in that sense, what Proposition 13 did by effectively very severely reducing the availability of decentralized political decision-making in California was to embark on a project of fiscal federalism reform. That is to shift responsibility for fiscal matters away from the local governments and to the state government. Now, this is not very often noted in public discourse. It's been mentioned here, of course, several times today. This has its origins in the three words in Proposition 13, according to law, which indicated that the revenues from the newly reduced property tax would be allocated among local governments according to law. And many of you know, I'm sure with much greater expertise than I, the details of SB 154 and AB 8 and Proposition 1A and all of the various iterations that resulted in what we, let me put it this way, that determine the amount of property tax revenues that local governments receive. The key point here is that Prop 13 didn't just cut the property tax, it converted the property tax from a local tax to a state tax. I was at a conference about a year ago in Boston of the National Tax Association, and a representative from the U.S. The Census Bureau, who does the work on the census of governments, indicated that they continue to count the California property tax as a local tax. But there's hardly any sense in which the California property tax is a local tax. The rate and the base are specified in the state constitution, and the revenues are allocated according to state law. There's really no local fiscal autonomy with respect to the tax whatsoever. So I want to heed John Fund's admonition from this morning to do more than just bemoan Proposition 13 and try to suggest or offer some constructive reform proposals that are not just let's do away with this, that, or the other thing, but they're sort of in the spirit of Proposition 13. So specifically, when we're thinking about fiscal federalism issues in a modern Prop 13 setting and assuming the long-term durability, the long-term political durability of Proposition 13, are there changes that could be made that would return some degree of local fiscal autonomy to local governments, whether it's cities, counties, school districts, but at the same time are also respectful of the political instincts that gave rise to Proposition 13, which we learned this morning are still quite important for our state. And as I see it, there are essentially three choices of revenue instruments that one could use in order to give local governments in California greater fiscal autonomy. The first, of course, is the property tax, which we can assume is off limits, I think, given that any tinkering with Proposition 13 is naturally going to arouse suspicions in the voting population, even if it's a perfectly legitimate and reasonable sort of modification. The second revenue instrument is a sales tax, which I think it's fair to say is just a truly awful local tax. And I'm not even sure that the Bradley Burns 1% sales tax, which is responsible for all of the fiscalization of land use that's been discussed here today, really even qualifies as a local tax. And then the third one, of course, is the income tax. And so here I want to take issue with John's comment a few moments ago that it's not possible to have a local income tax. And I want to ask you to imagine if it would be possible to have a local income tax as a significant source of revenue for local governments here in California. Now, some of you may be thinking that the idea of giving local government more taxing authority hardly seems consistent with the spirit of Proposition 13, which, after all, reduced local government taxing authority. As you know, however, one of the outgrowths of Proposition 13 was Proposition 218 in 1996, the Right to Vote on Taxes initiative, which itself was an outgrowth of Proposition 62, a statutory initiative in 1986, which also imposed certain local voter approval requirements. That itself was a reaction to some court decisions that had been issued regarding the scope of the term special tax within the meaning of Proposition 13. So this is kind of going back to the idea that we're engaged in an ongoing process of determining the ground rules of our fiscal constitution. So under Proposition 218, which is now in the California Constitution, any local income tax requires voter approval. There's a different voter approval threshold for special taxes, which is the 2/3 majority that's required within Proposition 13, than for general taxes. For general taxes, the voter approval requirement is a simple majority. So a system of local income taxes in California would have to be accompanied under the terms of Proposition 218 with local voter approval for those income taxes. And I guess I want to suggest that the availability of that option is something that local governments in California should have as a final source of local fiscal autonomy within the framework of Proposition 13. And as we know, there are, I think now, at least 10 states here in the United States that have local income taxes. Of course, among them, Indiana, Ohio, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York City, of course, famous for its local income tax. And I think we can also learn not only from other states in the United States, but also other countries. For example, in Scandinavia, the local income tax is a major part of local government finance, particularly in Norway and in Denmark. So I would submit that there might be some value for California to look to the experience of these other jurisdictions to find ways to properly design a system of local income taxes for the state of California. So let me just say that one of the benefits of a system of local income taxes is that we do have federal and state income taxes that are up and running. A system of local income taxes can piggyback on that system. We have a very robust collection mechanism through the state and federal governments. The idea, of course, would be to give communities the option, not the requirement of doing this. So in that sense, it would be a local option tax. And then finally, the idea would be simply to change the mentality of tax reform in California. So rather than thinking of tax reform as something that is sort of fundamentally obstructed by Proposition 13, what are the ways in which we can work within the rules of Proposition 13 in a manner that advances the interests of sound public finance, so that when we're celebrating not the 30th anniversary, but the 40th or the 50th anniversary, hopefully we can look back and do something more than simply bemoan the consequences of Proposition 13. Thank you very much.
So let me briefly just point out that we've had a number of very provocative policy proposals put on the table, from scrapping the property tax and replacing it with some kind of state tax, to replacing it with local income taxes, to getting rid of the 2/3 supermajority requirement. Before turning it over to the audience, I just want to see if anyone on the panel has reactions to anyone else on the panel, if there's any dialogue to be had here.
Yeah, so I want to, you know, the danger of having academics on your panel is we always get off on these fantasy trips about what we could do. But I like the idea, and I was trying to think about this local income tax thing. So I guess one point is, you know, if we're going to stick with Serrano Priest, we don't need a local tax for schools. So, you know, that's off the table. We don't need to worry about that. That's why I was suggesting just a broader income tax, you know, like an Illinois, Indiana tax, where everyone pays 4% or 5% regardless of their income. Raise a lot more income that could finance. It would take the school burden away, and then you'd be left with cities and fire districts and counties. Yeah. See, a local income tax works better for those entities. School districts don't have really you know, it's administratively, it's kind of difficult. They have very small boundaries, and Anyway, I like the idea, though, that Pennsylvania actually has a local income tax for schools. So it has been done. It's limited, but it has been done. Oh, I'm sorry.
I was going to yield to the audience, but I feel like after two proponents of that I just couldn't let an opportunity go by. And certainly in a state with such significant disparities of income, I'm trying to think about what it would mean for people in some of the small towns in the Central Valley, for people in Compton, and how long they're going to wait for a fire truck to arrive if we decide that we're going to support local fire services with an income tax. And Marin, on the other hand, will have a fire truck assigned to every house in the county, so you'll just have it there waiting in case you need it. I certainly think while there are a lot of problems with our current system, and certainly high wealth areas do get a lot more sales tax revenues, that to scrap the system we have now, certainly on the education side, might work better than what we've got now, I think, in terms of basic local services, which are now very much supported by the local property tax. Problematic, to put it mildly. And then we can go into all how you shelter your income in low tax rate counties, but that's for another year.
We have a reply.
Yeah, so, okay, so how about this? So we take all the property tax away from schools, replace that with an income tax, and then let local jurisdictions tax property for the services, the local services, up to the 1% limit. And that would have plenty of room under the limit for that.
That's a deal.
Deal? Okay.
I just want to throw out there also that at least in Denmark, their system of local income taxes is coupled with a rather robust system of equalization grants, which I think is a feature. This is not something that I'm guessing the California electorate is dying to embrace.
Also, that's the most equal income distribution of probably any country in the world compared to the most unequal distribution in the industrialized world.
Fair enough. What I mean to suggest is there are design options worth considering before rejecting the idea out of hand.
Just to continue this conversation that John brought up, and then a question. Arthur Laffer, the supply-side economist, has actually made the same proposal in a different way. He suggested that if you have a 6% flat income tax in California and a 6% value-added tax, you can eliminate every other tax and raise the same amount of revenue. He said you'd also could keep the sin taxes for the purposes of controlling sin, but not for necessarily raising money. One thing that I haven't heard today, and I didn't even bring this up, but John mentioned the biggest part of any budget is personnel costs. Reflecting back to 1978 to 2008, we seem to have had great increases on the public sector, personnel salaries, retirement benefits, health care benefits. That's the spending side of this equation. Do we control that, or do we just try to find new revenue sources to pay for it?
Oh, go ahead.
I'll start, and I'm sure John will. There's very interesting research that I was thinking of during John's remarks by the Economic Policy Institute that came out earlier this year, which compares teachers in 50 states to salaries for teachers, to occupations for other similarly educated professions. I think they have accountants and some others are their comparison group. For example, in California, actually, if you control for, sort of in a demand-based world, other professions that draw on college-educated labor, we actually pay about 80% of, teachers actually are paid about 80% of what their comparable occupations would be, which is substantially below the differential. I think nationally it was somewhat like 90%. I'd be happy to point people to the reference for that study, but I think it does a lot to debunk the argument that we are somehow overcompensating. I think John did touch on it. Schools compete with other employers for college-educated labor. They've got to compete in the marketplace.
Could I amplify that? Because we've actually done 2 of these studies ourselves about teachers, not all public. No, actually, no. In a recent.
This is the study I'm talking about compares to private employers.
No, that's what we're doing.
Okay.
Yeah, so we use for teachers, we use college-educated workers in every state. There's a BLS indicator, and compare public and private workers. And actually, we come up with California public workers getting relatively more. It's about a 5 or 6%. I can't remember the exact number, 5 or 6% premium. It's not huge, but it's relatively higher. But no, ours are salary. Okay, so that's a good point. Good point. The numbers I just gave you are salary and benefits up there. But okay, here's another thing. So just as we're on this subject, so we're a high wage state. So you got to compete. And I'm a big believer in actually teacher quality is the solution. Attracting good people into the teaching profession is the solution for our schools, and not just in California, others. So now I always take a survey of my students in my my upper division class. How many are going to go into teaching? Well, no, they're not going to go into teaching. We're not paying people enough to get the kind of students that used to go into teaching when women didn't have the opportunities they have now. Now, that's our problem, I think. So I'm with you to a certain extent, but there is I have a question mark there too. Yeah. What's that? Yeah. I'm with you there.
I just wanted what I took from that Public Policy Institute survey was finding that California pays its teachers and its school employees about 35% more than the average in the other 49 states. It also has the same 35% for correctional employees, for police and fire. So there is certainly a correction by taking California's salaries in general are higher, but that's only about 15%. So we are paying, after that correction, a premium of 20% for a whole range of public employees. And I was wondering, did we do that 30 years ago too, or is that a development within the last?
No, we don't know. But I think your numbers are just a little bit off. But if we look at the ratio of public employee salaries to college-educated workers in California,
I wasn't looking at that. I was looking at California public employee salaries versus public employee salaries in other states.
You have to look at the market. So there's a competitive market in each state. So you have to compare public sector salaries to private sector salaries. That's what you're competing with if you're a school district, for example. And you want to look at that ratio, because private sector salaries differ dramatically. That's why Texas has such good schools, because with very little money, because they don't have to pay teachers anything, because the private sector doesn't pay people anything. So
I think the other John wanted to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I want to encourage this argument. It's out there, and I think it's worth having, and I think the relevant comparisons are state by state and to the other public sector comparisons. One point where I was looking at BLS numbers for college graduates compared to teachers in California, it looked to me like teachers were actually paid more. I didn't say overpaid. But the other thing that strikes me now, working with a young person that I actually don't know the analytic answer to, is the hoops to get through being certified as a teacher actually keep you out of the job market for some substantial amount of time. They look to me to be, from just anecdotal evidence, even greater than getting into an accounting profession. So I think this is both. There's some barriers to entry into the market, into the role, in addition to the wages. The other thing I wanted to mention, which is sort of coincident to this, is the deployment of people into roles. And I don't know it well for K-12, but in most of the rest of the public sector, one of the things that happened beginning in the late 60s and early 70s was a reduction in frontline employment and a great increase in people who had planning, managerial, integrating compliance roles. And so Chaikin and Walker from RAND did an analysis of the employment in Los Angeles, and it was really stunning. And as someone who's then a faculty member, I knew where my graduates were going from USC in a public administration program. I think that this is part of the notion of waste in government, back to this getting something for nothing. I actually don't think that is wasted employment necessarily, but we change to a society now which has a lot more just transaction costs to get anything to the frontline delivery. And that adds in a range of costs that we're beginning to ramp up as Proposition 13 came in place, and I think continue to accelerate. So when you really look at what's required to run these systems now, it is much more than just the teacher salaries for education, but getting Prop 13, we've had a conversation about education here, but it's really the entire public sector finance of the system of California. And I think it's a broader conversation about employment, but also what you get and how you deploy it. To say just one sentence about the property tax idea, local property tax idea. Almost all the resource issues I identified have to be dealt with at a regional or state level. So that's so a local property tax doesn't get you there. You're going to have to go, and even things like the sales tax increment for regional transportation have been a county level effort. So you're going to be county or bigger to deal with the resource problems that I believe we're going to have to deal with.
There's, although there's something to be said for connecting taxes with some of the problems. So I mean, the idea of local taxes for local services is very interesting. And I don't think they were proposing eliminating state taxes. But really, I'm a union representative for lecturers and librarians who work at UC, and one thing that has only been glanced at, I mean, not even really glanced at in this day, has been the effect of Proposition 13 on the University of California. It seems to me that the resource issues and the expense issues and the job market issues, the job markets for academics, and I believe Gene Ross said something about what's happening to students, but there's also profound changes in this institution, and perhaps not all of them can be blamed on Proposition 13, but certainly the atmosphere of the shift from public resources and public control over resources to private control over resources, and the idea that you can pay teachers less and less and less, and academics less and less and less, and they will take it. And for some reason, job market considerations don't count when we're talking about teachers, though they count very much when we're talking about administrators and CEOs. And I'm just wondering if there's any sort of comment here about you know, how the University of California is different today, perhaps because of Proposition 13.
I think certainly if you look at the legacy of ballot box budgeting, it has been to wall off certain parts of the state budget in various ways, and the CSU and UC systems are a notable exception to the rule of sort of, or the trend towards protecting spending for a variety of institutions. Second thing that's happened, and so every time you have we have a budget crisis, certainly the universities are front and center in terms of an entity that gets cut. The other thing that I didn't talk about in the two-thirds vote is the trade-off between taxes and fees. And what you can do by majority vote, and certainly through the regents by no vote whatsoever, is to increase fees. So we're seeing student fees. When I went to the University of California, it was $200 a quarter. I've already told you how long ago that was. But certainly I think even, I haven't done the inflation adjustment on that. It's certainly gone up a lot more because of that. And I think to close, and I am the last I'm the second to the last person. Peter would be the last person in the world that would suggest that anybody go out and pass an initiative to wall off a greater share of the budget. Community colleges tried to do that this year and lost, I think appropriately so. The problem that the university systems have is that we are a state where about a third of the population has a college degree, and the share of those degrees that come to institutions of the caliber of this one is far, far smaller. So I don't think you probably would get a lot of, even with an older, whiter, more educated, more affluent electorate, I don't think you'd get a lot of support from the voters.
You know, just a comment. So I came to UC Santa Barbara in 1977, the fall of 77, so I have lived my entire life as a Proposition 13 university. And we've been doing pretty well. And, you know, the history of the University, University of California gets treated special, is what you said. But, you know, if you look across those universities, you know, Berkeley had a rough time in the kind of mid-'80s. The quality of Berkeley is pretty damn good. UCLA is great. San Diego is terrific. Davis and Santa Barbara are pretty good. You know, that's 5 really good universities in a system. And, you know, if I were to say anything about, you're going to hate me for this, but I was going to say anything about the University of California, I would say, you know, we got to start increasing fees, because we are providing a subsidy to upper and middle income and upper income kids in California. And, you know, because I know the census tracts that my kids in my urban economics class come from, because I make them do a paper about that. And I can tell you they are, you know, there's some low income tracts, but they're from the wealthier areas of California. And the fact that we're subsidizing them to the extent that we are, that doesn't make, I'm not comfortable with that.
Just historically, factual comment, supposedly on dissertations I sat in on too for education, California since World War II has always had large class sizes and paid its public employees more than average. So it's a pattern that the state has across its public employees, fewer per capita, but you pay them more. And we also have strong unions that do well by them. I also agree with John, and I'm on lots of academic senate committees, and you can't say this. But the truth is that the problem is that academics at places like UC really now respond to a market in their profession, not just to their civil service ranking. And it's the combination with that, people teach less than they used to because of market conditions. We've had to drop the number of classes, or we lose people to the big privates. And so it's a complex process, and you know, you can't just do a simple analysis unless you want to have a system where everybody, if you're really good, you go to Stanford, otherwise you go to UC.
No comment from the panel? If not.
I have 3 relatives who either teach in public school or public university. And my niece, Carol Schaefer, who teaches economics in public schools, she doesn't think she's being paid enough. She thinks the salaries are way low. But she would be the first to acknowledge this. There are 3 questions that have to be asked in addition to salaries for teachers. First, what percentage of private sector college graduates currently have a defined benefit pension? It has gone down dramatically in recent years. It's below 50. I don't have the exact numbers. I suspect the number for public school teachers is dramatically higher, way higher. That's a benefit. Defined benefit pension is a gold standard that is not available any longer to a lot of people in the private sector. Second factual question. How many public school teachers in California were fired last year, not for incompetence or misbehavior, but because of economic conditions? I know that in many college-educated professions, over a career, 9, 10, 11% of people are fired or laid off. What percentage is that among public school teachers? All I know is it's smaller than 9, 10, or 11%. I don't have the numbers, but maybe you do. That's a benefit. That's part of the compensation package. Stability of employment, real stability of employment, which is not very common in this country anymore. Maybe it should be. Third point, I know how many days a year I work. I get 3 weeks vacation. How many days, including prep time, including academic seminars, how many days a year does the average public school teacher work for the salary that they get compared to the average private sector college graduate working in their field? I don't know the answers to these questions, but perhaps some of the people up there do.
I'd love to take this on. So as we used to say, I was a department chair for many years, and we used to say, I hear all the time my colleagues complaining about being underpaid. And I would say, well, if you're underpaid, then that means that you have another job that would pay you better or you like better, and so go there. So I think the opportunity is there for you, John. If public school teaching is such a great deal, then maybe you should be in that profession. Right. Well, there's the deal. So I agree. Now, this is not the way I would set up that system. I would not set up a system with tenure. I would not set up a system with a salary schedule that's rigid as, that's not the way I would set it up. And I would gladly get rid of that system. But I really think we have set up a system that we are not attracting the best, with your sister's exception, the best people into public school teaching. I just do not, it's not something that is on the radar screen for my students. And I think part of it is it's just too damn static. I mean, I think the system is static. But all those things that you talk about, that doesn't mean a lot to someone who's thinking about, should I go to law school?
Let's raise salaries 30% and adjust tenure.
Deal, another deal. So yeah. I think probably 30 is a little low.
40.
Yeah. So they would start somebody at 60. I think we got to go higher. But you're on the right track.
I enjoy this conversation, but I would like to go. I teach at a state college where I have significant numbers of students who want to be teachers. It's a different class of students, and they have a different mobility track, and they have a job entry perspective. There are pluses and minuses to that system. Just like at the UC, right? There's a plus and minus. But I am surprised in all this discussion today that 3 issues haven't been raised. One, just briefly, one is that Proposition 13 fits into a long history of anti-newcomer policies of California, all the way back from the Californios to the present, all the way to 2009 and the introduction of pressures to newcomers to buy property. And or where we put the burden on the newcomer. And the other part of that is, it goes to John Kirlin's issues, 2 issues that John Kirlin raised, which have significant issues. One is that we attract people in our MPA programs and public administration programs, which I've also taught at, into assuming that they get a middle management job as soon as they leave. There's a high transactional cost, and there's very difficult to find people who are going to be the street sweepers or the entry clerks at the planning department. They all want to make policy decisions. That's what they all want to do. And part of that comes from Proposition 13, where one of the benefits of Proposition 13 was a shift of local managers, in my estimation, to become responsible for their departments and their operations. They are no longer, the way city finances, local government finances used to work was Proposition 13, and the property tax was the filler, the last decision made in the collection of revenues. Now it became so the governments were not pressured to make any decision about what's the most appropriate level of spending or what's the appropriate level of service delivery. And what has happened now is Proposition 13 comes to the top, which puts pressures on fees and the requirement to generate fees and sales taxes and everything else. And in response to that, what local governments have done wisely is to decide to make decisions about how much level of services are done, which raises what the economists like to do, in my estimation, which is to say local governments are best in terms of making delivery services. And I think that's a great rational process from economist perspective. But from an equity consideration, it's the worst decision to make, because local officials cannot make, local voters cannot make wise equity decisions, or do not make wise equity decisions. If they did, we would continue, and they do, we have discriminatory practices of all sorts on local decisions. No, you can't come into my neighborhood, you can't have a yellow curtain on your house, you can't do all these kinds of things that local governments officials do and local voters do all the time. They just refuse to let newcomers come in or to make decisions. So I think maybe the idea is to get rid of local governments in a large way. I mean, we created 58 counties in California as a function of the 1870s, the way, it took an hour to ride your horse to the county seat. It doesn't work any longer. So, the problems, there are lots of externalities that are present that John Kirlin has talked about, the Delta and the coast and the air quality and a variety of things, prisons. A prisoner goes from Los Angeles to Pelican Bay. It's like, there's lots of things that we could have done, and I'm surprised that there's no greater love of Prop 13 in this table other than, a few feet away from here. I could throw another stone for FSM down here at Sproul Hall, in front of Sproul Plaza.
I tried in the introduction to my remark to draw a direct line from Prop 13 to what had been going on in the rising diversity of California to the 1960s, and I absolutely do think that was what led to, I think my words, the old Californians acting out against New Californians, and I think that the further down the list that you go, and the Paul Gann quote that I used really is Prop 4, the Gann Amendment through Prop 218, through all of the project, that line of progeny really is an older, whiter, more affluent electorate trying to hold on to what's theirs and not to share with a new generation of Californians. And I think Peter's written about that in his sequel to his book that primarily discussed Proposition 13. But I think that is absolutely the line. And somebody in the last panel talked about a not very coded quote from Howard Jarvis on why he believed the way that he did. And I think there is a very, very direct connection, and I'm fairly guarded in those types of comments.
I'll ask if anyone else on the panel has any last remarks, and if so, please keep them brief, and then we will turn it over to our host, Jack Citrin. With that, I think Joel Fox has the last word, or Howard Jarvis, perhaps. And
he knew
that. We have allocated a few minutes for concluding remarks. I'm going to make those, and I'm going to make them extremely brief. I first want to collectively thank all of the panelists, all of the speakers, because I think this has been a I was thanking you. I thank all of the participants. I want to also thank, of course, a very attentive and patient audience, and to thank again all of the people working the equipment here and providing the food, and Mark and Janine just for a wonderful job. So maybe we can thank them with a round of applause. I have to say that when I attend this long an academic conference, at the end of the day, I'm always reminding myself, usually I remind myself of William Buckley's famous comment that he'd rather be governed by the first 100 names in the Boston phone book than by the Harvard faculty. But I think today our distinguished experts outdid the Harvard faculty, and I have to say that I learned a lot, not only in concrete things, but I think the way in which the discussion was framed was significant because it brought to the fore what the fundamental value issues are involved, and I think reasonable people can disagree. How large should the size of government be? What should government do? What should the private sector do? Who should pay for it? And in some sense, what should be the distributional effects, both of taxes and spending? And I thought we heard a lot of really important and interesting things about that. If you started out with a sense of deliverance, you probably ended up with a sense of doom, but that's the way it usually is at these events, you know. The more you think about what is, the more you wonder why it isn't something different. Let me just say one sort of maybe more substantive thing, which I think actually gets at the last comment, maybe changing society, changing California, changing demographics, changing ethnicity. It seems to me that if you are going to expect a community to transfer resources from the private to the public sector, and to do so willingly, and to do so in a way that distributes things in, let's say, that redistributes from the wealthy to the poor, from the haves to the have-nots, that can only happen for a sustained period of time on the basis of a sense of community, on a sense of mutual trust, on a sense of we are doing this for people who we somehow accept as us. And there are many, many elements in American politics, including the celebration of subgroups, the celebration of identity groups, the emphasis on differences rather than commonalities, that undermine that. And that is certainly one part of what has happened in California and what's happened in the United States. And to run around saying about how unfair it is, I think, frankly, a little bit naive. One of the elements that the tax revolt represented, and I want to emphasize this, not only because this has been the sort of core of my academic career, so I have to believe in it, but I think it's true, is the loss of legitimacy of the elite vis-a-vis the voters, the level of mistrust, the level of cynicism, the level of suspicion that has sort of pervades this whole period that we've been talking about, that and remains entrenched today. And until there's some way to erode that in a democracy, well, ultimately people can vote, and they do have these institutions which they can put initiatives on the ballot. You're not going to get all of these great things that have been suggested here. I just speaking personally here, the notion of giving the city of Berkeley the opportunity to have an income tax and that they will immediately seize, to me, will end up feeling like giving cocaine to a drug addict. That just happens to be my attitude to the people running this city. So, but, you know, and
you know you're on camera.
And I will, that's okay. It's a free country. It's a free country. But that, you know, I may not be alone, I may be alone, but the larger issue is a sense of trust and a sense of community is important. And to the extent some of these measures have eroded that, they are further to blame. So I think that's another message that we take away from here. And the final message is no matter how much we would like to live in Sweden or Denmark, we don't. We live in the United States, and the United States is a particular political culture which has to be accepted as part of the cost of doing business. Now, let me tell you the most important thing is where we can all go, and everyone is invited to have some food and wine. It's in the Institute of Governmental Studies, Moses Hall. Mark tells me that there is a map somewhere amongst your things, which if you have There's a map. Janina's holding it. That is probably decipherable to people with a higher IQ than mine, but I'll tell you how to get there. Take the elevator down to the first floor. As you come out of that elevator, turn left, walk out of Barrows Hall, walk in a straight line. You will see a little bridge. Cross that bridge, and the first building across that bridge to the left is Moses Hall. So let's adjourn there, and thank you again, everybody.